Hello everyone. Before we dive into this incredible true story, don't forget to subscribe to Silent Human Greeting and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of our videos and help our content reach more people who also love compelling stories. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Benning as the convoy of black SUVs pulled through the main gate on a sweltering Tuesday morning in August 2019. The MIT Military Technology Exchange Program was making its quarterly visit, bringing some of the brightest engineering minds from one of America's most prestigious universities to observe cutting-edge military training and technology. Sarah Chen stepped out of the lead vehicle, squinting behind wire-rimmed glasses as she adjusted the shoulder strap of her laptop bag. At 22, she was the youngest participant in the exchange program, a third-year mechanical engineering student who specialized in computational fluid dynamics and ballistics modeling. Her small frame, barely 5'3", was dwarfed by the towering military personnel around her, and her civilian clothes, khaki pants, a MIT polo shirt, and comfortable walking shoes made her stand out even more among the crisp military uniforms. The program coordinator, Dr. Robert Williams from MIT's engineering department, gathered the group of 8 students and faculty members near the base's administrative building. "Remember, we're here as observers," he emphasized, mopping sweat from his forehead. "This is an active military installation engaged in training some of the world's most elite soldiers. We're privileged guests, so please maintain appropriate decorum and follow all instructions from our military liaisons." Sarah nodded along with the others, though her mind was already racing with excitement. This was her first time on a military base, and everything fascinated her, from the precise geometry of the buildings to the mathematical precision evident in how soldiers moved in formation. As someone who had spent most of her life buried in textbooks and computer simulations, the real-world application of physics and engineering principles was thrilling. Their military escort was Sergeant Major Marcus Jackson, a 20-year Army veteran whose presence commanded immediate respect. Standing 6'4" with graying temples and piercing blue eyes, Jackson had the weathered look of someone who had seen combat in multiple theaters. His uniform displayed an impressive array of ribbons and decorations, including a Bronze Star and multiple deployment badges. "Welcome to Fort Benning, home of the infantry school," Jackson announced as he led the group across the base. "Today, you'll be observing training exercises involving our most advanced marksmanship systems. What you see here represents the cutting edge of military precision and technology." As they walked, Sarah noticed the meticulous attention to detail in everything around them. The drill sergeants barking orders to new recruits, the perfectly maintained equipment, the mathematical precision of soldiers marching in formation. It all appealed to her engineering mind. She pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down observations, calculating distances and angles almost unconsciously. "That's Sarah," Dr. Williams explained to Jackson when he noticed her note-taking. "She's one of our brightest ballistic students. Straight A's in advanced mathematics, physics, and fluid dynamics. She's actually working on her senior thesis about atmospheric effects on long-range projectile trajectories." Jackson glanced at Sarah with mild interest but obvious skepticism. "Computer simulations are one thing," he said diplomatically. "Real-world application is quite another. There's a big difference between theory and practice when you're dealing with actual combat conditions." Sarah looked up from her notebook, pushing her glasses up her nose. "I understand, Sergeant Major. I'm here to learn from the practical applications. My simulations are only as good as the real-world data I can incorporate into them." The group's first stop was the Marksmanship Training Facility, a sprawling complex of shooting ranges that extended far into the Georgia countryside. The sound of gunfire echoed constantly across the base. Single shots from precision rifles mixed with the rapid-fire chatter of automatic weapons. For Sarah, who had grown up in the quiet suburbs of Boston, the constant noise was both overwhelming and oddly exciting. "This is where we train our designated marksmen and scout snipers," Jackson explained as he led them to an observation tower overlooking the long-range precision course. "The targets you see out there are positioned at various distances from 800 meters to 2,800 meters. These soldiers train daily to engage threats at extreme ranges under adverse conditions. Through high-powered spotting scopes, the MIT group could see soldiers positioned at firing points, their massive rifles mounted on bipods as they engaged targets that appeared as tiny dots in the distance." Sarah was fascinated by the technology, the advanced optics, the precision machined rifles, the computer-assisted ballistics calculations. The Barrett M82A1 is our primary long-range system, Jackson continued, pointing to the massive rifle being used by a soldier below. 50 caliber, effective range out to 2,000 meters, though we regularly engage targets beyond that in optimal conditions. Each rifle costs about $12,000, and the training to produce a qualified marksman takes 6 months. Sarah was scribbling furiously in her notebook, calculating bullet drop, wind drift, and atmospheric effects at the ranges Jackson mentioned. Her mathematical background made it easy to understand the physics involved, though she had never seen it applied in such a dramatic real-world context. The biggest challenge we face, Jackson explained, is environmental factors, wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, even the Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation. All of these have to be accounted for at extreme ranges. Our shooters spend as much time studying meteorology as they do practicing marksmanship. Dr. Williams nodded appreciatively. That's exactly the kind of real-world complexity that Sarah's thesis is trying to model computationally. She's developed some fascinating algorithms for predicting atmospheric effects on ballistic trajectories. Jackson looked at Sarah again, this time with a hint of curiosity. Is that so? What kind of variables are you accounting for in these algorithms? Sarah felt suddenly self-conscious as all eyes turned to her, but her passion for the subject overcame her shyness. Well, the primary factors are atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, humidity levels, and the target's elevation relative to the firing position. But there are also more subtle effects like the Magnus effect from bullet spin, and at extreme ranges, you even have to account for the Coriolis effect. Jackson raised an eyebrow. The Coriolis effect? That's pretty advanced stuff for a college student. It's just physics, Sarah replied modestly. At distances over 1,000 meters, the Earth's rotation can cause a deflection of several inches. It's more pronounced at higher latitudes and when shooting east-west rather than north-south. Several of the other MIT students looked impressed, but Jackson seemed more skeptical than convinced. Well, that's all very theoretical, he said. But out here, we rely on experienced shooters who can read conditions and make adjustments based on years of practice. There's an art to it that computers can't capture. Sarah nodded respectfully, though privately she disagreed. In her experience, most art was just science that hadn't been properly quantified yet. But she was here to learn, not to argue with a career military professional. The group spent the morning observing various training exercises, and Sarah found herself increasingly fascinated by the precision required for long-range shooting. She watched soldiers make minute adjustments to their scopes, accounting for wind conditions that changed by the minute. She observed how they positioned their bodies to achieve maximum stability, how they controlled their breathing to time their shots between heartbeats. What struck her most was the mathematical precision underlying everything. Each adjustment to a scope was calculated in minutes of angle, MOA, with 1 MOA representing approximately 1 inch of adjustment at 100 yards. At longer ranges, tiny errors in calculation resulted in misses by several feet. It was applied mathematics at its most dramatic. During lunch break, Sarah found herself sitting alone at a picnic table, reviewing her notes and running calculations on her laptop. The other MIT students were discussing the morning's observations, but Sarah was lost in her own world of numbers and equations. She had identified several areas where she thought computational modeling could improve upon traditional methods of ballistic calculation. Sergeant Major Jackson approached her table, carrying a cup of coffee and looking genuinely curious. Mind if I sit down? I'd like to hear more about this research you're doing. Of course, Sergeant Major, Sarah replied, closing her laptop slightly but keeping her notebook open. I hope I wasn't being presumptuous earlier. I know there's a lot more to actual marksmanship than just mathematics. Jackson chuckled. Don't apologize for being smart, Miss Chen. I've been doing this for 20 years. And I'm always interested in new approaches. Tell me more about these algorithms you mentioned. Sarah opened her laptop and showed Jackson some of her preliminary work. I've been trying to create a comprehensive model that accounts for all atmospheric variables simultaneously. Traditional ballistic calculators handle each factor separately, but in reality, they interact with each other in complex ways. Jackson studied the screen, though most of the mathematical notation was beyond his understanding. And you think this could improve accuracy over current methods? In theory, yes, Sarah replied carefully. Of course, it would need extensive field testing to validate the models. Computer simulations can only take you so far. Jackson nodded approvingly. Now that's the kind of humility I like to hear from an academic. Too many university types think they can solve military problems without ever getting their hands dirty. Sarah blushed slightly. I definitely want to get my hands dirty. That's why I'm here. All the theory in the world doesn't mean anything if it doesn't work in practice. As they talked, Sarah found herself warming to the gruff sergeant major. Despite his initial skepticism, he was clearly intelligent and genuinely interested in improving military effectiveness. She began to understand that his wariness of academics wasn't personal. It was based on experience with researchers who proposed impractical solutions to real-world problems. The afternoon was scheduled to include a demonstration of the base's most advanced marksmanship systems, including the new Barrett M82A1 rifles that had recently been upgraded with computerized ballistic calculators. Sarah was particularly excited about this portion of the visit, as it would give her a chance to see how military technology was evolving to incorporate more sophisticated computational methods. As the MIT group gathered at the long-range firing position, Sarah could feel her excitement building. She had spent 3 years studying ballistics in theory, but she was about to see the absolute cutting edge of practical application. What she couldn't know was that she was about to become much more than just an observer. The stage was set for a demonstration that would challenge everything everyone assumed about the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical skill, between classroom learning and real-world expertise. Sarah Chen, the quiet engineering student from MIT, was about to discover that sometimes the most unlikely people are capable of the most extraordinary things. The Georgia heat shimmered off the distant targets as the afternoon's demonstration began, and Sarah adjusted her glasses one more time, ready to observe what she expected would be an impressive display of military precision. She had no idea that within hours, she would be the one providing the demonstration that everyone would remember. The afternoon sun had grown even more intense by the time Sergeant Major Jackson led the MIT group to the advanced marksmanship demonstration area. The long-range precision course stretched out before them like a mathematical problem made manifest. Targets positioned at carefully measured distances, extending far into the Georgia countryside, some so distant they were barely visible even through high-powered optics. "What you're about to see," Jackson announced to the group, "represents the pinnacle of military marksmanship technology. We've recently upgraded our Barrett M82A1 systems with the latest ballistic computers, and we're going to demonstrate their capabilities at extreme range." Sarah pulled out her notebook and began sketching the range layout, automatically calculating sight lines and angles. The targets were positioned at 1,200, 1,800, 2,200, and 2,800 meters, distances that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with small arms fire. At the furthest range, a bullet would be in flight for nearly 4 seconds, plenty of time for wind and other environmental factors to affect its trajectory dramatically. "The conditions today are challenging," Jackson continued, consulting a handheld weather station. "We've got variable winds gusting up to 15 miles per hour, temperature at 94 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity at 78%. Not ideal for precision shooting, but these are the kinds of conditions our soldiers face in real combat situations." The demonstration rifle was a Barrett M82A1, a massive 50 caliber weapon that looked more like a piece of artillery than a traditional rifle. Mounted with the latest Night Force optics system and equipped with a computerized ballistic calculator, it represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in military technology. Sarah was fascinated by the integration of digital systems with traditional marksmanship. It was exactly the kind of hybrid approach her research was exploring. Staff Sergeant David Morrison, Fort Benning's top-rated instructor marksman, took position behind the rifle. Morrison was a legend at the base, with multiple combat deployments and numerous marksmanship awards. If anyone could demonstrate the capabilities of the new system, it was him. "Sergeant Morrison holds the unofficial base record for long-range precision," Jackson explained with obvious pride. "He's consistently accurate out to 2,500 meters under good conditions. Today we're going to push that envelope even further." Morrison began his shooting sequence methodically, starting with the closer targets to establish his zero and warm up the rifle system. The 50 caliber rounds produced thunderous reports that echoed across the range, and Sarah found herself automatically calculating the physics involved, the enormous pressures generated in the chamber, the ballistic coefficient of the massive bullets, the energy required to propel them accurately across such vast distances. The first few targets fell easily. 1,200 and 1,800 meters were well within Morrison's comfort zone, and he dispatched them with mechanical precision. But as the range extended, the challenges multiplied exponentially. At 2,200 meters, it took Morrison 3 shots to achieve a hit, and Sarah could see him consulting his ballistic calculator between each attempt, making adjustments for the changing wind conditions. "This is where it gets interesting," Jackson murmured to the MIT group. "At these distances, you're not just fighting physics, you're fighting time. Wind conditions can change significantly during the bullet's flight time." Sarah was scribbling calculations furiously, trying to model what she was observing. The ballistic computer on Morrison's Morrison's rifle was sophisticated, but she could see areas where her more comprehensive atmospheric modeling might provide advantages. The system seemed to handle individual variables well, but it didn't appear to account for the complex interactions between different atmospheric factors. When Morrison moved to the 2,800-meter target, the real challenges began. His first shot missed completely, passing somewhere to the right of the target. The second shot was closer, but still off target. By the third attempt, Sarah could see frustration beginning to show in Morrison's body language. "The wind's playing tricks out there," Morrison called back to Jackson. "It's swirling differently at various altitudes, and the computer's having trouble getting a clean read." Jackson nodded sympathetically. "Take your time, Sergeant. Show our guests what you can do." Morrison's fourth shot at the extreme range target was close enough to see the impact through the spotting scopes, but it was still a miss. The fifth attempt was similarly near but unsuccessful. Sarah could see that Morrison was fighting not just the environmental conditions, but the limitations of his ballistic calculation system. Dr. Williams leaned over to Sarah. "What do you think? Could your algorithms handle these conditions better?" Sarah studied her notebook, where she had been tracking wind patterns, temperature variations, and other environmental factors throughout the demonstration. "Maybe," she said quietly. "The ballistic computer seems to be treating each variable independently, but at these ranges they interact in complex ways. I think I can see the pattern the wind is following." Jackson overheard the conversation and turned toward them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "You think you can see a pattern that our best marksman and a $30,000 ballistic computer can't figure out?" Sarah immediately felt self-conscious, realizing how her comment might have sounded. "I didn't mean to suggest—" No, Jackson interrupted, raising a hand. "I'm genuinely curious. What pattern do you think you're seeing?" Sarah opened her notebook and showed Jackson her observations. "The wind isn't just variable. It's cycling. There's a pattern to the gusts that repeats approximately every 40 seconds. The ballistic computer is trying to calculate for current conditions, but by the time the bullet reaches the target, the wind has shifted into a different phase of the cycle." Morrison, who had been listening from his firing position, looked back with interest. "You're saying the timing of the shot matters as much as the calculation?" "Exactly," Sarah replied, gaining confidence. "If you could time the shot to coincide with a specific phase of the wind cycle and calculate for where the wind will be, rather than where it is, you might achieve better accuracy." Jackson looked skeptical but intrigued. "That's an interesting theory, Miss Chen. But theory is one thing. Practical application is another." Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant Major. It's easy to observe from the sidelines. Actually executing a shot under these conditions requires skills I don't have." There was a moment of silence as the group contemplated the challenge. Morrison had now taken 7 shots at the 2,800-meter target without a hit, and the afternoon heat was making conditions even more difficult. The demonstration that was supposed to showcase military precision was instead highlighting the limitations of even the most advanced systems. It was Morrison himself who broke the silence. "Sergeant Major, what if we let the professor's student give it a try? At worst, she'll miss just like I have. At best, maybe she's onto something with this wind timing theory." Jackson looked surprised. "Sergeant Morrison, this is a .50 caliber rifle. Miss Chen has no military training, no experience with weapon systems. Neither did I. The first time someone handed me a rifle," Morrison interrupted with a grin. "Besides, if her calculations are right, maybe the shooting skills matter less than the timing and math. What's the worst that could happen? She misses a target I've already missed 7 times? Sarah felt her heart racing. The idea of actually firing the Barrett was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'm not sure that's appropriate. I'm just here as an observer." Dr. Williams looked concerned. "Sarah, you don't have any experience with firearms. This isn't a computer simulation." "Actually," Sarah said quietly, "I do have some experience. I grew up on my grandfather's ranch in Wyoming. He taught me to shoot when I was young." She paused, then added, "He was a veteran, Korean War. He took marksmanship very seriously." This revelation changed the atmosphere immediately. Jackson's expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity. "What kind of shooting did you do on this ranch?" Sarah felt embarrassed to admit it. "Long-range prairie dog hunting mostly. My grandfather had a custom rifle chambered in .243 Winchester. We'd shoot out to, well, pretty far distances." "How far?" Morrison asked from his position behind the Barrett. Sarah hesitated. "Sometimes 800 or 900 yards. My grandfather said it was good practice for reading wind conditions." Jackson and Morrison exchanged glances. Long-range precision shooting was a specialized skill, whether applied to military targets or prairie dogs. The principles were the same, and 800-900 yards was no trivial distance. "Tell you what," Jackson said after a moment of consideration, "if Dr. Williams approves, and if you're comfortable with it, we'll let you take a few shots at the closer targets. Nothing extreme. Maybe the 1,200-meter target to start." If you can demonstrate that you can handle the rifle safely, we'll see about testing your wind theory. Dr. Williams looked uncertain. I'm not sure the university's insurance covers students firing military weapons. This would be considered part of the educational exchange, Jackson assured him. We have all the necessary waivers and safety protocols. Miss Chen would be under direct military supervision at all times. Sarah's mind was racing. Part of her was terrified at the prospect of firing such a massive weapon in front of a group of observers, but a larger part of her was intensely curious to test her theoretical knowledge against practical reality. This was exactly the kind of real-world validation her research needed. I'd like to try, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. If it's safe and appropriate, I'd very much like to test my calculations. Morrison began explaining the basics of the Barrett system as Sarah approached the firing position. The rifle was indeed massive, nearly 5 feet long and weighing over 30 pounds. The 50 caliber rounds were enormous, each one the size of a small cigar and containing enough explosive power to disable vehicle engines at long range. The recoil is significant but manageable, Morrison explained as Sarah settled behind the rifle. The muzzle brake redirects most of the blast, but you'll still feel it. The key is proper body position and follow-through. Sarah positioned herself according to Morrison's instructions, feeling the weight and balance of the weapon system. The stock felt familiar against her shoulder, reminding her of countless hours spent with her grandfather's rifle on the Wyoming prairie. But this was orders of magnitude more powerful than anything she had ever fired before. The ballistic computer is already set up for current conditions, Morrison continued. But if you want to test your wind timing theory, you'll need to make manual adjustments based on your calculations. Sarah studied her notebook one more time, reviewing her observations of the wind patterns. She had identified what she believed was a 40-second cycle in the wind gusts, with a brief calm period occurring every cycle. If she was right, timing a shot to coincide with that calm period would significantly improve accuracy. I'd like to try the 2,800-meter target, she said, looking up from her calculations. If my theory is wrong, it won't matter what distance I shoot. If I'm right, the effect will be most pronounced at extreme range. Jackson looked surprised. Miss Chen, that's the target Sergeant Morrison has been trying to hit. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to start with something closer? Sarah considered this. Sergeant Major, my grandfather always said that if you're going to test a theory, you might as well test it properly. Half measures don't prove anything. Morrison grinned. I like her attitude. Besides, if she misses, she'll just be joining a very exclusive club, people who have missed the 2,800-meter target on a windy day at Fort Benning. Sarah positioned herself behind the Barrett, adjusting her body position according to Morrison's guidance while keeping her eyes on her watch. She needed to time her shot precisely if her wind theory was correct. The mathematics were clear in her mind, but she was about to discover whether mathematical precision could translate into practical accuracy. The target seemed impossibly small through the scope, barely visible even at maximum magnification. Sarah took a deep breath and began to wait for the right moment in the wind cycle she had identified. In about 30 seconds, if her calculations were correct, there would be a brief calm period that would give her the best chance of success. What happened next would either validate her theoretical approach or serve as a humbling reminder of the difference between classroom knowledge and real-world expertise. Sarah Chen, the quiet engineering student from MIT, was about to find out which category she belonged to. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger as she watched the seconds tick by on her watch. 20 seconds until the wind pattern should enter its calm phase. Through the scope, the 2,800-meter target looked impossibly small, a tiny speck that wavered in and out of the heat mirage rising from the Georgia countryside. The Barrett M82A1 felt steady beneath her, its massive weight actually helping to stabilize her position. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Patience, Sarah. The shot will tell you when it's ready. Don't force it. Wait for the moment when everything aligns. Whenever you're ready, Miss Chen, Sergeant Major Jackson said quietly from behind her. No pressure. Even our best marksmen struggle with this target under these conditions. 15 seconds. Sarah could feel her heartbeat steadying as she fell into the rhythm her grandfather had taught her years ago on the Wyoming prairie. Breathe in slowly. Exhale halfway. Hold. Align. Squeeze. The same technique that had worked on prairie dogs at 800 yards should work on paper targets at 2,800 meters, if her atmospheric calculations were correct. 10 seconds. The wind indicators she had been watching showed the beginning of the calm period she had predicted. The grass around the distant target stopped its constant swaying and stood nearly motionless. The mirage patterns through the scope stabilized slightly. This was her moment. Sarah made one final adjustment to her scope, cranking in 2 additional minutes of angle based on her calculations of where the wind would be during the bullet's 4-second flight time, not where it was at the moment of firing. It was a counterintuitive adjustment that went against the ballistic computer's recommendation, but her mathematical models suggested it was necessary. 5 seconds. Sarah exhaled slowly and found her natural respiratory pause, that moment between breaths where her body was most stable. Her finger began applying steady pressure to the trigger, not jerking or pulling, but squeezing gradually the way her grandfather had taught her. The Barrett erupted with a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the entire firing line. The massive muzzle brake redirected the blast sideways, creating a shockwave that kicked up dust in all directions. Sarah felt the substantial recoil push against her shoulder, but she maintained her position and followed through, keeping the scope trained on the target area. For what seemed like an eternity, but was actually just under 4 seconds, everyone on the firing line held their breath. At 2,800 meters, even with high-powered optics, it was difficult to spot bullet impacts immediately. The heat mirage and distance made precise observation challenging. Morrison, who was watching through a separate spotting scope, suddenly straightened up. "Holy shit," he breathed, then quickly looked around apologetically at the civilian guests. Holy, that's a hit. That's definitely a hit." Jackson grabbed his own binoculars and focused on the distant target. After a moment, he lowered them with a look of complete disbelief. "Miss Chen, I don't suppose you'd like to explain to me how a college student with no military training just accomplished what our top marksman couldn't manage in 7 attempts? Sarah was still looking through the scope, hardly believing what she was seeing. The target clearly showed a bullet hole, and while it wasn't a perfect center hit, it was well within what would be considered an effective shot at that range. Her hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline as she made the rifle safe and sat back from the firing position. I think I got lucky with the timing," she said, though even as she said it, she knew it was more than luck. Her atmospheric modeling had worked exactly as predicted. Dr. Williams was staring at her with amazement. "Sarah, do you realize what you just did? You succeeded where military professionals with advanced computer systems failed." Morrison stood up from his spotting position, shaking his head in wonder. "Miss Chen, that was a hell of a shot. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I'm not sure I could replicate what you just did." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention and praise. It was just applied mathematics, really. The wind pattern was predictable once you recognized the cycle. "I think anyone could have made the same calculations." "But they didn't," Jackson pointed out. "Our ballistic computer didn't recognize that pattern. I didn't see it. Sergeant Morrison didn't see it. You did. That suggests this isn't just luck or beginner's fortune." Sarah opened her notebook and showed them her wind observations. "I've been tracking the pattern for over an hour. The gusts follow a fairly consistent cycle, about 40 seconds from peak to peak, with a calm period lasting 8 to 12 seconds right in the middle. If you time your shot for the middle of that calm period and calculate for atmospheric conditions during the bullet's flight time rather than at the moment of firing, the accuracy improves dramatically." Morrison studied her notes with growing interest. "You're saying the computer was calculating for current conditions, but by the time the bullet got to the target, those conditions had changed?" "Exactly. At 2,800 meters, the flight time is nearly 4 seconds. That's enough time for significant changes in wind patterns, especially with the cycling I observed." Jackson was beginning to understand the implications. "If you're right, this could revolutionize long-range marksmanship training. We spend months teaching shooters to read current conditions, but you're suggesting we should be predicting future conditions instead." "It's not entirely new," Sarah replied modestly. "Naval artillery has used similar predictive calculations for decades. I just applied those principles to small arms fire." Morrison was already repositioning himself behind the Barrett. "Can you walk me through your method? I'd like to test this on the other long-range targets." Sarah consulted her watch and notebook. "The next calm period should begin in about 20 seconds. For the 2,200-meter target, you'll want to adjust your scope 2 minutes of angle to the left of the computer's recommendation, accounting for where the wind will be during the bullet's 3-second flight time." Morrison made the adjustments Sarah suggested and waited for her signal. When she indicated the optimal timing, he fired. Through the spotting scopes, they could see an immediate hit on the 2,200-meter target. "I'll be damned," Morrison muttered. "That's the cleanest shot I've made all day." Jackson was now fully convinced that they were witnessing something significant. "Miss Chen, would you be willing to demonstrate this technique on multiple targets? I'd like to document this for our training protocols." What followed was the most remarkable marksmanship demonstration in Fort Benning's recent history. Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah successfully engaged 6 different targets at ranges from 1,800 to 3,400 meters. Her longest successful shot, at 3,400 meters, established a new unofficial base record and was made under conditions that most expert marksmen would consider nearly impossible. But it wasn't just the distance that impressed the observers, it was the consistency and the method. Sarah's approach was systematic, mathematical, and repeatable. She would study her notebook, calculate the timing for the wind cycle, make precise adjustments to the scope settings, and then wait for the optimal moment to fire. Each shot followed the same methodical process, and each shot was successful. By the time she finished the demonstration, word had spread throughout the base. Officers and instructors who had heard about the MIT student shooting impossible distances began gathering at the range. Sarah found herself surrounded by career military professionals who wanted to understand her technique. Colonel Patricia Hayes, Fort Benning's commanding officer, arrived just as Sarah was making her final shot at 3,400 meters. When that shot proved successful, Hayes approached the firing line with obvious curiosity. "Sergeant Major Jackson," Hayes said, "I'm hearing some remarkable reports about our civilian guest. Would you care to explain what's been happening here?" Jackson quickly briefed the colonel on Sarah's performance, emphasizing the mathematical approach she had developed. "Ma'am, in 20 years of military service, I've never seen anything like this. Miss Chen has essentially developed a new methodology for extreme-range precision shooting." Colonel Hayes studied Sarah with interest. "Miss Chen, I understand you're a student at MIT?" "Yes, ma'am. Third-year mechanical engineering, specializing in computational fluid dynamics and ballistics modeling. And you developed this technique as part of your academic research?" Sarah nodded. "My senior thesis focuses on atmospheric effects on projectile trajectories. Today was my first opportunity to test the theoretical models against real-world conditions." Hayes looked impressed. "And the results?" Sarah consulted her notebook. 6 successful hits out of 6 attempts, at ranges from 1,800 to 3,400 meters, under challenging wind conditions. The mathematical models appear to accurately predict atmospheric effects on bullet trajectories. The implications were becoming clear to everyone present. This wasn't just an academic exercise or a lucky afternoon on the range. Sarah had potentially developed a method that could significantly improve military marksmanship capabilities. Dr. Williams pulled Sarah aside as the crowd of military personnel continued to discuss her performance. "Sarah, do you understand what you've accomplished here? You've essentially proven that computational modeling can enhance one of the most traditional military skills." Sarah was still processing the events of the afternoon. "I just applied the same principles I've been studying in class. I never expected the results to be this dramatic." "The military is going to want to study your methods," Dr. Williams warned. "This could lead to research opportunities, consulting contracts, maybe even changes to your academic program. Are you prepared for that level of attention?" Sarah looked back at the group of officers still clustered around the Barrett M82A1, animatedly discussing the implications of what they had witnessed. "I just wanted to test my thesis research," she said quietly. "I had no idea it would lead to this." Morrison approached them, grinning broadly. "Miss Chen, I don't know what your plans are after graduation, but the Army could sure use someone with your skills. What you did today is going to change how we train marksmen." Sarah felt both excited and overwhelmed. In a single afternoon, she had gone from being a quiet observer to the center of attention for an entirely new approach to military marksmanship. Her theoretical research had proven itself in the most dramatic way possible, and the implications were only beginning to become clear. As the sun began to set over Fort Benning, Sarah packed up her notebook and laptop, knowing that her life had just changed dramatically. The quiet engineering student who had arrived that morning as an observer was leaving as someone who had potentially revolutionized a fundamental military skill, but the real changes were still to come. Hello, everyone. Before we conclude this incredible story of precision and innovation, don't forget to subscribe to Silent Human Greeting and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of our videos and help our content reach more people who also love compelling stories. 3 months after Sarah Chen's remarkable demonstration at Fort Benning, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The quiet engineering student who had simply wanted to test her thesis research was now sitting in a Pentagon conference room, surrounded by some of the military's most senior leaders, discussing the implementation of what had become known as the Chen protocol for long-range precision shooting. The room room was imposing, polished mahogany table, American flags in the corners, and walls lined with portraits of military leaders dating back to the Revolutionary War. Sarah felt small in her conservative business suit, clutching a leather portfolio that contained the refined version of her atmospheric modeling algorithms. Across the table sat General Patricia Morrison, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, alongside representatives from the Army Marksmanship Unit, the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, and various defense contractors. Miss Chen, General Morrison began, your demonstration at Fort Benning has generated considerable interest throughout the military community. We're here today to discuss how your techniques might be integrated into our standard marksmanship training protocols. Sarah nodded nervously. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of validation testing, peer review, and increasingly high-level meetings. Every test had confirmed what happened that August afternoon in Georgia. Her mathematical approach to predicting atmospheric conditions significantly improved accuracy at extreme ranges. The results speak for themselves, Sarah replied, opening her portfolio to reveal charts and graphs documenting extensive testing. We've conducted trials at 7 different military installations across varying climates and conditions. The Chen protocol has demonstrated a 340% improvement in first-shot hit probability at ranges exceeding 2,500 meters. Colonel David Martinez from the Army Marksmanship Unit leaned forward. Miss Chen, can you explain in layman's terms how this differs from our current ballistic calculation methods? Sarah had practiced this explanation dozens of times over the past months. Traditional ballistic computers calculate for current atmospheric conditions what the environment looks like at the moment of firing, but at extreme ranges, bullets can be in flight for 3 to 5 seconds. During that time, wind patterns, pressure variations, and temperature gradients can change significantly. She pulled out a tablet displaying an animated simulation. The Chen protocol uses predictive atmospheric modeling. Instead of calculating where to aim based on current conditions, we calculate where to aim based on what conditions will be during the bullet's flight time. It's the difference between shooting at where the target is versus shooting at where it will be. General Morrison studied the data with obvious interest. And this approach works consistently across different environments? Yes, ma'am. We've tested successfully in desert conditions at Fort Irwin, jungle humidity at Fort Sherman in Panama, high altitude at Fort Carson in Colorado, and coastal environments at Camp Pendleton. The mathematical principles remain constant, only the specific atmospheric variables change. Captain Lisa Rodriguez from the Marine Scout Sniper School had been reviewing Sarah's technical documentation. Miss Chen, I have to ask, how did a college student with no formal military training develop techniques that our most experienced marksmen had never considered? Sarah had anticipated this question. I think it's precisely because I didn't have traditional training that I approached the problem differently. Military marksmen are taught to read current conditions and react to what they observe. My background in computational fluid dynamics led me to think about predicting future conditions instead of just observing current ones. It's a perfect example of fresh perspective solving old problems, Dr. Williams interjected. He had accompanied Sarah to the Pentagon as her academic advisor and liaison with MIT. Sometimes expertise in one field can be limiting when applied to another field. Sarah's engineering background allowed her to see patterns that marksmen trained in traditional methods might miss. The discussion continued for over 2 hours, covering implementation strategies, training protocols, and equipment modifications needed to support the Chen protocol. Sarah found herself answering increasingly technical questions about atmospheric modeling, ballistic coefficients, and computational requirements. Major General Robert Hayes from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, had remained quiet throughout most of the meeting, but finally spoke up. Miss Chen, we're prepared to offer you a position as a civilian consultant with the Department of Defense. The work would involve refining your protocols, training military instructors, and developing next-generation ballistic calculation systems. Sarah felt her heart racing. 6 months ago, she had been worried about completing her undergraduate thesis. Now she was being offered a position that could define her entire career. General, I'm honored by the offer. Could I ask about the scope of the work? Initially, you'd be based at Fort Benning, working directly with the Marksmanship Training Unit to integrate your methods into standard curricula. Long-term, we're looking at establishing a new research division focused on computational ballistics. You'd essentially be creating an entirely new field of military science. Dr. Williams looked pleased but cautious. Sarah still needs to complete her undergraduate degree at MIT. Could the position accommodate her academic requirements? Absolutely. We'd work with MIT to ensure she can complete her studies while contributing to this research. In fact, We'd prefer to maintain the academic connection. Universities often have resources and perspectives that complement military research. Sarah looked at her notebook, where she had been automatically calculating angles and distances even during the meeting. It was a habit she had developed since childhood, unconsciously applying mathematical analysis to everything around her. The Pentagon conference room, she had already determined, was 32 feet long by 24 feet wide, with the ceiling at 12 feet, proportions that followed classical architectural ratios her engineering training had taught her to recognize. "There's something I need to mention," Sarah said quietly. "The techniques I developed aren't just applicable to military use. The same atmospheric modeling principles could improve accuracy for civilian competitive shooting, hunting, and even law enforcement applications." General Morrison nodded. "We've considered that. The protocols you've developed could revolutionize precision shooting across multiple sectors. Are you comfortable with that level of impact?" Sarah thought about her grandfather, the Korean War veteran who had taught her to shoot on his Wyoming ranch. He had always emphasized that shooting was about precision, patience, and respect for the equipment, for the conditions, and for the responsibility that came with the ability to place projectiles accurately at long range. "My grandfather always told me that with great precision comes great responsibility," Sarah replied. "If these techniques can make military personnel more effective at protecting our country, and if they can help civilian shooters be safer and more accurate, then yes, I'm comfortable with that impact." The meeting concluded with Sarah accepting the consultant position, contingent on MIT's approval of a modified academic program that would allow her to complete her degree while working with the military. As the participants filed out of the conference room, Captain Rodriguez approached her. "Miss Chen, I wanted to thank you personally. I've been a Marine sniper for 8 years, and what you've developed is going to save lives, both American service members and the people we protect. Your work represents the kind of innovation our military needs." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "Thank you, Captain. That means more to me than any academic recognition could." 6 months later, Sarah stood on the same Fort Benning firing line where her journey had begun, but this time as an instructor rather than an observer. The first class of military marksmen to be trained in the Chen protocol was lined up behind Barrett M82A1 rifles, ready to attempt shots that had been considered nearly impossible just a year earlier. "Remember," Sarah called out to the students, "you're not shooting at where the target is now. You're shooting at where atmospheric conditions will place your bullet when it arrives at the target. Trust the mathematics, time your shot to the environmental cycle, and follow through." Sergeant Morrison, now her co-instructor, watched with pride as the students began engaging targets at 3,200 meters, distances that would have been fantasy a year earlier. The success rate was remarkable, 78% first shot hits at extreme range, compared to the previous standard of less than 15%. "Miss Chen," Morrison said during a break between exercises, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been here that day? If you'd just stayed an observer instead of taking that first shot?" Sarah considered the question while watching her students methodically working through their atmospheric calculations. "I think someone would have eventually developed similar techniques. The mathematical principles were always there. They just needed someone to recognize and apply them." "Maybe," Morrison replied, "but it took someone with your unique background, the engineering training, the childhood shooting experience, and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. That's not a common combination." The program Sarah had developed was already being expanded beyond Fort Benning. Military installations worldwide were implementing the Chen protocol, and civilian shooting schools were requesting access to the techniques. Sarah's academic thesis, which she had finally completed, was being published simultaneously in military journals and civilian shooting magazines. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. During a ceremony at Fort Benning, marking the first anniversary of her demonstration, Colonel Hayes presented Sarah with a framed letter. "This is from Staff Sergeant James Patterson, currently deployed in Afghanistan," Hayes explained. "He was one of the first military marksmen trained in your protocols. Last month he used your techniques to successfully engage hostile targets at 3,100 meters, protecting his unit during a firefight. He wanted you to know that your work has already saved American lives in combat." Sarah read the letter with tears in her eyes. Patterson had written, "Miss Chen, I don't know if you realize what your work means to those of us in harm's way, but your techniques gave me the confidence and capability to protect my brothers when it mattered most. Thank you for changing what's possible." As the ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey from that first shot at Fort Benning to this moment. She had entered the military base as a curious student wanting to test theoretical research. She was leaving as someone who had fundamentally changed a military capability, that dated back centuries. The mathematical principles she had discovered weren't magic, they were simply the logical application of atmospheric science to ballistic problems. But the impact had been transformational. The Chen protocol had become standard curriculum at military academies, police sniper schools, and civilian marksmanship programs worldwide. Dr. Williams approached her as the ceremony ended. "Sarah, I have to ask, any regrets about the path your life has taken? You were on track for a traditional engineering career, maybe working for a tech company or pursuing graduate research. Instead, you've become the world's leading expert in computational ballistics." Sarah looked out over the Fort Benning ranges, where she had made her first impossible shot. "Dr. Williams, my grandfather used to say that life presents opportunities, and you can either recognize them or let them pass by. I'm grateful I recognized this one. And what's next? You've revolutionized military marksmanship, established a new academic field, and influenced shooting sports worldwide. Where do you go from here?" Sarah smiled, pulling out the notebook she still carried everywhere. "There are always more problems to solve. I'm working on atmospheric modeling for artillery systems now, and there are applications for naval gunnery that nobody has explored yet. The same mathematical principles that work for small arms should apply to much larger projectiles. So you're going to keep pushing the boundaries?" "That's what engineers do," Sarah replied. "We find problems that seem impossible and figure out ways to make them possible. My grandfather taught me to shoot accurately at long range. MIT taught me to model complex systems mathematically. The military taught me that theoretical knowledge means nothing unless it works in practice. I'm just going to keep combining those lessons and see what develops." As Sarah walked away from Fort Benning that afternoon, she reflected on how a single moment of curiosity had changed not just her life, but military capabilities worldwide. The quiet engineering student who had once been just there to watch had proven that sometimes the most unlikely people are capable of the most extraordinary innovations. The Chen protocol would continue to evolve and improve, but its fundamental principle would remain unchanged. That precision comes from understanding not just current conditions, but predicting future ones. It was a lesson that applied far beyond marksmanship, and Sarah was already thinking about where to apply it next. Her grandfather would have been proud, not just of the shooting, but of the way she had used precision and patience to solve problems others had considered unsolvable. The ranch in Wyoming where she had learned to read wind patterns was a long way from the Pentagon conference rooms and military academies where she now worked, but the fundamental lessons remained the same. With great precision comes great responsibility. Sarah Chen had embraced that responsibility and used it to change what was possible. The shot that had started everything was just the beginning of a career that would continue pushing the boundaries of what engineering and determination could accomplish. As she drove away from Fort Benning, Sarah was already calculating angles and atmospheric conditions for her next challenge. After all, there were always more impossible shots to make possible.